Some stories from the past are not easy to revisit, not only for the harm they caused but for the difficult questions they raise about trust, community, and the hidden corners of human nature. The life of John Wayne Gacy is one such story, a chapter in American history that invites us to look closer, not to dwell in fear, but to remember, to learn, and to honor the strength of those who endured. If you appreciate a gentle, honest approach to exploring difficult stories, one that centers victims, compassion, and the power of remembrance, feel welcome to join this community of thoughtful listeners and readers. Reflection and kindness make every conversation stronger. With that, let's begin. John Wayne Gacy's early life was, in many ways, unremarkable, a story shaped by the patterns of mid-century America, by the hopes and hardships of an ordinary family. He was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942, the second of three children. His parents, John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson, worked hard to provide for their family. Gacy's father was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist, while his mother was a homemaker. The Gacys lived in a working-class neighborhood on the city's southwest side, a place defined by close-knit blocks, familiar routines, and the certainty of church on Sundays. Even as a child, John was eager to please. He was described as sensitive and eager for approval, especially from his father, whose praise seemed to matter more than anything. But his father was a strict and often harsh man. Family memories later painted a picture of a household ruled by discipline, sometimes crossing the line into cruelty. John Sr. struggled with alcohol and was quick to anger, sometimes subjecting young John to verbal and physical abuse. The wounds left by these early years were mostly invisible, but would cast a long shadow over Gacy's later life. School, for Gacy, was a mixture of challenge and comfort. He struggled with health problems, a congenital heart condition that sometimes left him weak and unable to join the rougher games of other boys. This sense of difference, combined with his father's criticisms, shaped how he saw himself. Teachers described him as polite but not especially gifted academically. He was a people pleaser, eager to make friends and quick to volunteer for classroom chores, but he carried with him a nervousness that never quite faded. Despite these hardships, Gacy found ways to carve out a place for himself. He joined clubs, helped with church events, and found solace in his mother's affection. She was his steady supporter, always offering a gentle word or a listening ear. In her, Gacy found the comfort and reassurance that eluded him elsewhere. But the tension at home never fully disappeared. His father's disappointment was a constant undertone, growing sharper as John struggled to keep up in sports and schoolwork. Adolescence was a period of confusion for Gacy. He continued to struggle academically and socially, sometimes bullied by classmates, often left out of after-school games. The combination of ill health, insecurity, and the harsh environment at home left him isolated. He became skilled at hiding his feelings, presenting a cheerful face to the world while wrestling with loneliness and self-doubt inside. Still, he dreamed of being someone important, someone admired, successful, respected. After high school, Gacy's life followed a winding path. He tried college but left before graduating, working a series of odd jobs and searching for a place to belong. For a time, he moved to Las Vegas, where he worked as a mortuary attendant. The experience was short-lived and left a mark on him, a fascination with death that he would later describe as unsettling. Gacy soon returned to Chicago, settling back into the rhythms of family and familiar streets. It was in these early years of adulthood that Gacy's natural charm and desire for approval began to take a more public shape. He discovered a talent for leadership and a flair for performance. He became involved in local Democratic Party politics, volunteered for community organizations, and found that people responded to his energy and willingness to help. In these circles, Gacy was often seen as a man on the rise, ambitious, likable, and dedicated to the common good. He was eager to prove himself, and the community, for a time, embraced him. In 1964, Gacy married Marlon Myers, the daughter of a successful business owner in Springfield, Illinois. The marriage seemed to offer him a new beginning, stability, respectability, and the chance to build a family of his own. Gacy joined his father-in-law's fast food business, quickly advancing to manage 3 KFC restaurants. The young couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy threw himself into work and community life, joining the local JCs, a civic organization known for its focus on leadership, charity, and fellowship. To those who knew him in these years, Gacy seemed almost transformed. He hosted dinner parties, organized community events, and was quick to offer a helping hand to neighbors or colleagues in need. He became a rising star in the JCs, even earning recognition for his volunteerism and energy. At home, he and Marlon welcomed 2 children, a daughter and a son. On the outside, Gacy appeared to have achieved the ordinary American dream, a successful career, a loving family, and a respected place in the community. Yet beneath this surface, old insecurities and unhealed wounds lingered. Gacy's relentless drive to be liked, to impress, sometimes tipped over into manipulation. He was known for his charisma, but also for an eagerness to control situations, to always be at the center of attention. In his work, he was both generous and demanding, expecting loyalty and admiration in equal measure. Friends and coworkers admired his enthusiasm, but some also noticed his mood could change quickly, especially if he felt slighted or ignored. By his mid-20s, Gacy had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a story of redemption, a difficult childhood overcome, a family and career earned through hard work. But the cracks were there for those who looked closely. His marriage began to falter under the weight of long work hours, personal secrets, and the strain of Gacy's emotional needs. The need for approval that had driven him for so long was never quite satisfied. The stage was set for changes that would soon upend everything. In the years to come, the story of John Wayne Gacy would shift from that of a striving, troubled young man to one of the most infamous chapters in American history. But at the start, it was just a story of a boy and a family, a young man searching for belonging, and a community eager to believe in second chances. As we move forward, let's remember the importance of looking deeper, of offering kindness when we can, and of never forgetting the value of every life, especially those whose stories are so often lost in the shadows. If you're finding meaning in this journey, feel free to share your thoughts, or simply continue along as we unravel this difficult but necessary tale together. In Waterloo, Iowa, during the late 1960s, John Wayne Gacy was, to most of his neighbors and colleagues, the very picture of small-town American success. He was a young husband and father, a thriving restaurant manager, and a man whose boundless enthusiasm for community projects earned him admiration wherever he went. To many, he was someone who had turned the challenges of his childhood into a determination to help others, to lead, to make his mark in a world that often felt indifferent. But the more successful Gacy became on the outside, the more complicated and pressured his inner life became. He worked long hours, sometimes late into the night, eager to prove himself at every turn. The world of fast food management was demanding, and Gacy threw himself into the job, determined not to repeat the failures of his early years. At home, he hoped to be the husband and father he'd always wanted to have, a source of comfort and pride for his family. And in the JCs, he was a star, organizing fundraisers, helping run community drives, and always looking for new ways to show his worth. Yet the sense of belonging he so craved was never quite enough. Gacy's marriage to Marlon, which had begun with such promise, started to feel the strain of his ambition and need for attention. He was generous and often kind, but he could also be moody and demanding, sometimes withdrawing into himself or lashing out at the smallest perceived slight. Marlon struggled with his unpredictable moods, and friends occasionally wondered about the tension behind Gacy's cheerful public face. The desire to be admired had not erased the wounds of childhood, and Gacy was left wrestling with insecurities that no amount of praise could fully silence. During this time, Gacy's social life flourished. The JCs, known for their focus on service and camaraderie, provided an outlet for his energy and showmanship. Gacy organized events, recruited new members, and quickly became one of the chapter's most visible leaders. He hosted elaborate parties at his home, welcoming colleagues, neighbors, and local dignitaries. To many, he was a model citizen, charitable, outgoing, always willing to lend a hand. He was awarded for his work, promoted in business, and admired for his tireless volunteerism. But there were those who began to notice oddities behind the scenes. Some colleagues whispered about his occasional outbursts, or his eagerness to be the center of every gathering. A few sensed something off in the way he sometimes singled out young people for special attention, offering them jobs or gifts, taking an unusual interest in their lives. In a world where people wanted to believe the best, these observations were easy to dismiss. But in hindsight, they were the first signs that the cheerful mask Gacy wore was starting to slip. At home, the cracks widened. Marlon, juggling the responsibilities of raising 2 small children and managing a household, found herself increasingly isolated. Gacy's absences grew longer, and his explanations for late nights less convincing. He reassured her with gifts and promises, but she could feel the distance growing. Friends noticed the couple argued more frequently, and that Marlon often looked tired and anxious at parties she once seemed to enjoy. Despite efforts to patch things up, the foundation of their marriage was growing less stable by the day. In 1968, everything changed. Gacy's carefully constructed public image was shattered when he was accused of sexually assaulting a teenage boy who had been working for him. The accusations shocked the community. Those who knew Gacy struggled to reconcile the charges with the man they thought they knew, the devoted father, the energetic volunteer, the rising star in business and civic life. The trial that followed was painful for everyone involved, but the evidence was clear. Gacy was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The impact was immediate and devastating. Marlon filed for divorce, taking their children and leaving Iowa behind. Gacy's career was over, his reputation destroyed, and his standing in the community reduced to whispers and headlines. For the first time, the disconnect between the life Gacy showed the world and the reality he kept hidden became undeniable. The sense of betrayal rippled through Waterloo, leaving people unsure whom to trust, wondering how they could have missed the signs. Prison was a turning point, though not in the way one might hope. Gacy adapted quickly to life behind bars, throwing himself into the same patterns that had defined his life outside. He joined the inmate JCs, organized programs, and became a model prisoner, always eager to please, always striving for recognition. Wardens and guards noted his charm and work ethic. In letters to his family, Gacy insisted he had been wrongly accused, that he was misunderstood, and that he would someday rebuild his life. He never admitted wrongdoing, and he seemed, if anything, even more determined to control his image and the perceptions of those around him. While in prison, Gacy received news that his father had died. The grief was real. His relationship with his father, for all its pain, had shaped him deeply. Gacy wept when he learned the news and later described it as one of the lowest moments of his life. In the following months, he doubled down on his efforts to earn early release, convincing the parole board of his rehabilitation and good behavior. After just 18 months, less than a fifth of his sentence, Gacy was granted parole in 1970 and released from prison. He returned to Chicago to live with his mother, determined to rebuild his reputation and reestablish himself in the community. By law, he was not allowed to return to Iowa, and the conditions of his parole required him to avoid contact with minors and undergo regular supervision. Yet, in the bustle and anonymity of a big city, it was all too easy to slip through the cracks. Chicago in the early 1970s was a city of opportunity and change. Gacy, always resourceful, wasted no time in reinventing himself. He started a construction business, PDM Contractors, offering work to young men in the neighborhood, many of whom were drawn in by promises of good pay and mentorship. To his neighbors, Gacy was friendly and generous, quick to host barbecues and help out with local events. He even dressed as a clown, Pogo the Clown, to entertain at parties and charity fundraisers, a role that would later become infamous but, at the time, seemed just another expression of his community spirit. Beneath the surface, though, old patterns were re-emerging. The wounds of Gacy's early years, the insecurity, the need for attention and control, all simmered beneath the mask of ordinary life. He was, once again, a man in search of approval, striving to be liked and needed, even as darker impulses crept back in. The friends and neighbors who welcomed him back into the fold saw only the charming businessman, the doting son, the pillar of the community. But the community's willingness to forgive, to believe in second chances, allowed Gacy to rebuild his public life far more quickly than anyone could have imagined. He joined local organizations, supported Democratic political candidates, and once again became a familiar face at events and fundraisers. In 1972, he remarried, finding in Carol Hoff a partner who, for a time, believed in his promises of a new beginning. With her 2 daughters, they formed what looked like another chance at a normal family, a patchwork of old wounds and new hopes. Yet, for all these outward signs of success and redemption, the darkness that had haunted Gacy's early years had not gone away. It had simply grown better at hiding. In the years that followed, the quiet streets of Chicago's northwest suburbs would become the setting for events that no one in Gacy's world could have imagined, and the story, already marked by tragedy and deception, would take its most chilling turn. As we move forward, let us continue to remember the importance of looking beyond appearances, of caring for those on the margins, and of honoring the lives that, too often, are only remembered after it is too late. If you are finding value in this gentle, thoughtful retelling, feel free to share your thoughts or continue along as we walk carefully through the next chapters of this difficult but necessary history. When John Wayne Gacy returned to Chicago in the early 1970s, he found a city alive with possibility, diversity, and the constant churn of neighborhoods both new and old. For Gacy, it was a place to start over, a chance to leave behind the mistakes of Iowa, the pain of a broken marriage, and the stigma of a prison sentence. In the comforting swirl of his mother's home on Somerdale Avenue, he began to carefully rebuild the story of himself that he wanted the world to see. Chicago's northwest suburbs were places where people kept up their lawns, watched out for their neighbors, and believed that a little hard work could fix almost anything. Gacy, with his easy smile and knack for making connections, quickly became a fixture in his new neighborhood. He opened PDM Contractors, his own construction business, naming it after painting, decorating, and maintenance. The company soon became successful, taking on small jobs at first, then larger contracts for remodeling and repairs throughout the area. To the teenagers and young men who lived nearby, Gacy's business was an opportunity. He hired locally, often giving jobs to kids who were struggling to find work or who needed extra cash to help out at home. He presented himself as a mentor, always ready with advice or encouragement, and he paid more than minimum wage, an attractive offer to anyone trying to get a foothold in the adult world. For many, their first jobs came with Gacy's friendly handshake and the promise that hard work would be rewarded. But the lines between work and personal life were often blurred. Gacy hosted barbecues for his crew, took employees to the movies, and encouraged a kind of club-like loyalty. For a while, it seemed as if the dark chapters of his past were firmly behind him. Neighbors admired his energy. He was often the first to lend a tool, help with a project, or organize a street party. Parents trusted him, relieved to see their sons working for someone who appeared so rooted in the community. In his personal life, Gacy was determined to project normalcy and warmth. His second marriage to Carol Hoff in 1972 was, for a time, a source of hope. Carol, a divorcee with 2 young daughters, believed in Gacy's promises of a fresh start. Together, they blended their families, celebrating holidays, birthdays, and milestones as a new beginning for them all. Gacy played the role of devoted husband and stepfather, attending school events and neighborhood functions with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to fit in. It was during this period that Gacy's interest in community service blossomed in earnest. He joined local civic organizations, volunteered at fundraisers, and campaigned actively for Democratic Party candidates. By 1975, he had become a precinct captain in his district, responsible for helping get out the vote and supporting city council initiatives. He posed for photographs with Chicago's political elite, including First Lady Rosalynn Carter, a moment later captured and reprinted in newspapers as proof of his respectability. Perhaps the most curious part of Gacy's public persona was his role as Pogo the Clown. Gacy developed this alter ego, complete with painted face, baggy suit, and oversized shoes, to entertain at children's parties, hospitals, and community parades. He was proud of his clowning, often speaking of it as his contribution to making people smile and helping those in need. To onlookers, it was an eccentric but harmless hobby, a man who loved laughter and wanted to bring joy to his community. Yet beneath the cheerful exterior, familiar tensions simmered. Gacy's marriage to Carol grew strained. He spent longer hours at work and more time away from home, often returning late and offering vague explanations. Carol noticed his moods were unpredictable. He could be charming and loving one moment, then distant and irritable the next. Their home life became a series of small disconnects and unspoken worries. She saw changes in his habits: locked doors, secretive phone calls, unexplained absences, but struggled to make sense of them, always hoping that the man she married would find his footing again. For the young men who worked at PDM contractors, Gacy's charm could be magnetic, but it was also complicated. Some felt genuinely grateful for the opportunity and support he offered, but others found his attention uncomfortable or unsettling. He sometimes offered alcohol to his teenage employees, encouraged them to stay late, or insisted on one-on-one conversations that left them feeling uneasy. A few confided in friends or family, but most shrugged it off. He was, after all, the boss, a neighbor, someone who had earned the trust of so many. Meanwhile, Chicago in the mid-1970s was a city in transition. Neighborhoods changed, young people moved in and out, and the sense of anonymity that comes with urban life provided cover for secrets and struggles. Reports of missing teenagers, mostly boys and young men, began to appear in local newspapers, but each case seemed isolated, each story a private heartbreak. The city was busy, the police overworked, and runaways were, tragically, not uncommon. No one, not even the families of those who disappeared, could have guessed that there might be a pattern, a reason, hidden in the silence between homes and storefronts, parks and construction sites. For Gacy, the cracks in his life widened quietly. His second marriage faltered under the weight of suspicion and disappointment. In 1976, Carol filed for divorce, citing his unpredictable behavior and the emotional distance that had grown between them. She took her daughters and left the house on Somerdale Avenue, leaving Gacy alone once again with his business, his community connections, and the facade he had so carefully maintained. In the aftermath, Gacy threw himself even deeper into his public roles. He worked long hours, attended more political events, and redoubled his efforts to be seen as a pillar of the community. He sponsored parades, continued his clown performances, and was always visible at fundraisers or block parties. For many in the neighborhood, he was simply a hard-working bachelor with a quirky sense of humor, a little odd, perhaps, but nothing more. But as the months passed, small signs began to add up. Parents worried when their sons failed to return home from work or social events. Friends traded stories about uncomfortable encounters, about promises made and not kept. Some young men stopped working for Gacy, while others drifted away without a word. The police, too, began to take notice as missing persons cases in the area grew more frequent and more difficult to explain. For a long time, though, the pieces did not fit together. Gacy's reputation, his involvement in civic life, his willingness to help, these things provided a shield against suspicion. He was the man who knew everyone, who could always be counted on, who had paid his debts to society and then some. In a world that wanted to believe the best, it was easy to overlook the troubling details, to trust that someone so involved could not possibly be hiding something so terrible. It is, perhaps, one of the most difficult lessons from Gacy's story, the danger that can exist behind the most ordinary faces, the harm that can hide in plain sight. The young men who vanished, the families who searched, the neighbors who opened their homes to laughter and music, all were, for a time, unable to see what lay beneath the surface. The tragedy was not just in what happened, but in how long it took for the truth to come into focus. As we approach the next chapter of this story, it is with a renewed sense of empathy and awareness, a reminder that vigilance, care, and the willingness to listen are as vital as any law or investigation. The community of Chicago would soon find itself at the heart of one of the most shocking revelations in American history. But for now, the mask still held, and the darkness remained just out of sight. In the late 1970s, the streets and neighborhood surrounding John Wayne Gacy's house on Somerdale Avenue began to feel subtly different, as if the familiar fabric of community life was shifting beneath the surface. The laughter and music of neighborhood block parties still echoed on warm summer evenings, and Gacy's presence, always smiling, always involved, remained a steady backdrop. But beneath the routines of daily life, a quiet anxiety was growing, stitched together from whispered worries and unspoken fears. It started, as so many tragedies do, with a sense that something was just a little off. The teenagers and young men who worked for Gacy came and went, but some seemed to simply vanish, disappearing without the usual farewells or explanations. Parents waited anxiously for sons who didn't come home, making calls to friends and searching through city streets that felt, suddenly, unfamiliar. In some cases, police were contacted, reports were filed, and hope flickered that the missing would soon return. But the answers, when they came at all, were unsatisfying. Perhaps he ran away, maybe he found work in another town, or simply needed space. Runaways, it was said, were a sad but common part of life in the city. But for the families, the explanations rang hollow. They knew their sons, their routines, their habits, their voices on the phone. The missing left behind bedrooms full of clothes and unfinished homework, bikes locked up in garages, and plans for the weekend that were never kept. In kitchens and living rooms, parents clung to hope even as dread grew. Some walked the blocks at night, checking parks and bus stops, calling out into the silence. Others put up flyers and called hospitals, holding tight to the belief that answers would come. As the months turned to years, a quiet pattern emerged. The disappearances clustered around Gacy's home and his construction business. Some who vanished had worked for him, some were neighbors, some had simply crossed paths in the shifting tide of city life. Still, the pieces did not fit together easily. Each case seemed isolated, each pain unique. It was the loneliness of each loss that allowed the larger story to remain hidden, the thread unpulled, the darkness unrecognized. Gacy himself moved with practiced ease through this world of uncertainty. He maintained his routines, his community ties, and his role as a helper and volunteer. When asked about the young men who left his employ, he shrugged them off. "Teenagers are unreliable," he'd say, or, "He said he was moving away, I don't keep track." To neighbors, he remained affable and generous. If there were questions, he answered them with a quick wit and a wide smile. In public, the mask was still intact, hiding the growing sense of strain beneath. Yet there were moments when the facade seemed to flicker. Gacy's behavior, already unpredictable, became at times more erratic. Neighbors noticed his house was busy at odd hours. Lights would burn late into the night. There were rumors of strange smells, of locked doors, of anxious voices behind drawn curtains. Some workers left abruptly, refusing to say why. Parents cautioned their children to be careful, to avoid the house on Somerdale if they could. It was an atmosphere of suspicion, difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. Police, too, began to take notice. As missing persons files grew thicker, detectives started to compare notes, to look for links that had previously gone unnoticed. The process was slow, hampered by the limits of communication and the sheer scale of the city's day-to-day churn. Each disappearance was a small crisis, folded into the larger story of urban life. But by late 1978, the number of cases connected to the area around Gacy's house could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The turning point came with the disappearance of Robert Piest, a 15-year-old who worked part-time at a local pharmacy. On the evening of December 11, 1978, Robert told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a potential job. He'd be home soon, he promised. He never returned. The pain of that night was immediate and overwhelming. The Piest family, like so many before them, reached out to friends and neighbors, contacted the police, and waited for news that refused to come. Unlike earlier cases, though, Robert's disappearance triggered a wider response. He was well known and well liked, and his family was determined not to accept silence for an answer. Police quickly traced Robert's last steps and learned he had spoken to John Wayne Gacy about work. Detectives visited Gacy's home to question him. He was cooperative at first, confident in his ability to explain away any suspicion. He told them he had never seen Robert that evening. But as officers left, unease lingered. There were inconsistencies in Gacy's story, odd details in his home, items that seemed out of place, answers that didn't quite fit. Most of all, there was an instinct that told the detectives not to let this case go. The investigation that followed marked the beginning of the end for Gacy's carefully constructed world. Police began round-the-clock surveillance, watching his movements, cataloging visitors to his home. They checked records, re-interviewed witnesses, and compared notes with other investigators handling missing persons cases. Search warrants were issued, and the first thorough inspection of Gacy's home was conducted. What they found were small but chilling clues, items belonging to young men who had been reported missing, receipts and personal belongings tucked away in drawers and closets. For days, Gacy maintained his innocence, even as the pressure mounted. He spoke to police with the bravado of someone who still believed he could talk his way out of trouble. But the mask was slipping. He began to unravel under surveillance, his composure breaking down in private. Neighbors noticed his nerves. Workers recalled strange conversations and tense silences. Friends who had once trusted him now watched from a distance, unsure of what to believe. Then, in December 1978, with the evidence growing too overwhelming to ignore, police returned to Gacy's home with another warrant. This time, the search went deeper, into crawl spaces, beneath floorboards, and into the cold, dark places no one had ever thought to look. There, investigators made a discovery that would shock the city and the nation. What began as a search for a missing boy became the unveiling of one of the most horrifying crimes in American history. The community's grief was immense and immediate. The truth that began to emerge was almost impossible to comprehend. How so much pain could hide for so long behind a mask of normalcy and neighborliness. The families who had waited for their children to return were faced now with an unimaginable loss. The neighbors who had opened their homes to laughter and friendship now closed their doors in fear and sorrow. For those involved in the investigation, the days that followed were marked by a somber sense of duty. The process of identifying victims, of notifying families, of piecing together the story of what had happened inside Gacy's house, became a work of compassion and care. The city came together in mourning, determined to remember those lost not as victims of one man's cruelty, but as sons, brothers, friends, and neighbors, lives cherished, stories worthy of remembrance. As the mask of John Wayne Gacy finally fell, what remained was the undeniable truth that evil can sometimes hide in the most ordinary places, behind the most familiar faces. The work of healing, of seeking justice, and of honoring the lives lost would begin in earnest, but for now, the city stood in shock, learning to reckon with the darkness that had lived among them, hidden in plain sight. When the truth about John Wayne Gacy finally began to emerge from the shadows of Somerdale Avenue, the city of Chicago, indeed, the entire country, was shaken to its core. The story that unfolded over those winter days in December 1978 was not just about the crimes of a single man, but about the heartbreak and resilience of families, the dedication of investigators, and a community's first steps toward healing after an unimaginable loss. The search of Gacy's house began quietly at first, the officers moving through rooms with careful respect, unsure of what they would find. Each drawer opened, each closet checked, was a small act of hope. Maybe this time, the answers would be simple: a misplaced ID, a runaway's forgotten bag. But hope faded quickly as the first hints of something much darker appeared. Personal effects belonging to missing boys and young men, wallets, driver's licenses, high school rings, surfaced in the most unlikely places. It was evidence that linked Gacy not just to Robert Pius, but to a string of disappearances that had haunted Chicago's families for years. The crawl space beneath the house, dark, cramped, and cold, became the scene of one of the most painstaking searches in the city's history. Officers, some veterans of the force and others new to this kind of horror, moved slowly and methodically, sifting through earth and concrete. What they found there was almost beyond comprehension: the remains of boys and young men, many unidentified, some missing for years. It was as if, all at once, the pain and hope of a dozen families had come to rest in this hidden space, waiting to be seen, to be counted, to be remembered. News of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside the house, television crews set up camp on the quiet street, and the story made headlines around the world. But behind the glare of cameras, the real work was being done in silence and sorrow. The task of identification, matching dental records, combing through missing persons reports, speaking with families who had waited so long for word, became a grim responsibility for police and medical examiners. Each name recovered was both a heartbreak and a form of closure, an end to uncertainty that carried its own weight of grief. For the families who had spent years searching, hoping, and bargaining with fate, the news was both a blessing and a new wound. Some had always suspected that something terrible had happened. Others had held tightly to the hope that their loved one would someday return. Now, they gathered in waiting rooms and police stations, called by officials and asked the hardest questions of their lives. The process was slow and painful, but the kindness of those involved, the gentle words of detectives, the careful explanations of medical staff, helped to steady hearts broken by loss. As bodies were identified, the city moved through its own stages of mourning. Neighborhoods where laughter and possibility had once been the norm now held candlelight vigils and memorial services. Churches and schools opened their doors to those needing comfort or community. The faces of the lost, once only photographs on flyers or in family albums, became the focus of remembrance and prayer. In newspapers, reporters began to tell not just the story of Gacy's crimes, but the stories of the lives that had been lived: a high school athlete, a budding artist, a brother, a friend. These remembrances became a form of resistance against the darkness, a way to honor the lives that Gacy could not erase. The police investigation pressed on with quiet determination. Each new piece of evidence, every question answered, was a step closer to justice, but it was also a reminder of the responsibility now borne by everyone involved. The officers who spent days and nights sifting through the house, the forensic scientists who worked through fatigue and heartbreak to identify remains, the detectives who gently broke news to waiting families, all carried the weight of a city's grief. The work was exhausting, and for some, the memories would never truly fade. In the weeks following Gacy's arrest, the number of confirmed victims grew. The final count would reach 33, but for a time, the work was about more than numbers. It was about names, faces, and the need to bring each lost boy and young man home to the people who loved them. Some were identified quickly, the missing pieces of a long-standing puzzle finally falling into place. Others remained unnamed for months or even years, their stories waiting in the silence for answers that sometimes never came. The public response was a mixture of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. How could such horror have gone unnoticed for so long? How could someone so visible, so trusted, have been capable of such harm? In community meetings and over kitchen tables, people shared their memories, their regrets, and their fears. Some questioned the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Others wondered if they had missed some sign, some warning, that might have changed the course of events. The city was wounded, but in the aftermath, there was also a profound sense of solidarity, a shared determination to honor the victims and care for those left behind. For those at the center of the investigation, there was little time for reflection. The legal process began quickly, with Gacy charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial that loomed ahead would be long and difficult, but for now, the focus remained on the task of giving names back to the lost and comfort to those who mourned. The silence that had shrouded Summerdale Avenue was finally broken, not by violence, but by the quiet, determined work of seeking truth and justice. In the months that followed, funerals and memorials were held across Chicago and beyond. Each service was unique, shaped by the love of those gathered, by stories told and tears shared. Communities came together to offer support, to cook meals, to write letters, to sit in silence when words were not enough. In every act of kindness, there was a small assertion of hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, the bonds of family and neighborliness could endure. The children and young men lost to Gacy were never forgotten. Their names became a call for change, for better systems to protect the vulnerable, for closer attention to the needs of families in crisis, for a community that would never again turn away from the pain of its youngest members. The city would heal, slowly and imperfectly, but the lesson remained, a warning and a hope, a promise that such a story would never be repeated. As Gacy's trial approached, the attention of the world would turn again to Chicago, but for now, the focus remained on remembrance and care. The work of healing had only just begun, and for every family, every friend, every neighbor touched by this tragedy, the journey ahead would be one of patience, courage, and above all, compassion. When the last police car pulled away from Somerdale Avenue, and the world learned the full scope of what John Wayne Gacy had hidden, the city of Chicago braced itself for the long, difficult process ahead. The news had spread far beyond city borders. For weeks, the faces of lost boys and the house at the center of so much sorrow filled newspapers and television screens around the nation. But as the immediate horror gave way to grief, another challenge awaited: justice, and the questions that would echo through the halls of the Cook County Courthouse and across the hearts of all those touched by the case. The legal process began with a gravity that matched the pain of what had been uncovered. Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder, each one a testament to a life lost and a family forever changed. Prosecutors, police, and court staff knew this would not be an ordinary trial. It was not only about the crimes themselves, but about the failure of systems, the strength of families, and the need to make sense of something so senseless. Gacy's defense team, faced with overwhelming evidence, focused not on denying his involvement but on his state of mind. The question of insanity was raised, and much of the courtroom testimony would revolve around competing portraits of who Gacy truly was. Was he fully responsible for his actions, or was his mind so fractured, so twisted by trauma or illness, that he could not be held accountable in the way the law demanded? The prosecution, meanwhile, prepared to tell the story of each victim, not as numbers, but as sons, brothers, friends, and neighbors. Families were called to testify, each recounting the last moments with their loved ones, the sudden silence that fell over homes, the endless days of searching and hoping and not knowing. Their words were heavy with the love they still carried and the pain that had never left. For the investigators who had worked the case, the trial was both a burden and a responsibility. Some took the stand to describe the search, the discoveries in the crawl space, and the slow, careful work of identification. Others supported families behind the scenes, helping them navigate the unfamiliar world of courtrooms and legal terms. The sense of duty was profound. These men and women knew that justice, however imperfect, was owed to the lost and to the community that had entrusted them with the truth. The courtroom itself became a place of both sorrow and resilience. The proceedings were at times grueling. Testimony from forensic experts, psychologists, and those who had known Gacy as a neighbor, employer, or friend. There were moments of quiet, as the reality of the crimes became inescapable, and moments of anger, as the depth of deception and betrayal came into focus. Through it all, the families of victims showed remarkable strength. They sat together in support, leaning on one another for comfort, drawing on the community that had grown up around them in the aftermath of loss. Outside the courthouse, Chicago watched and waited. The city held vigils and fundraisers, built memorials, and made space for collective mourning. The case became a touchstone for conversations about safety, about the importance of listening to children and young people, about the need for better systems to help those who disappear. Neighborhoods, once defined by suspicion and fear, began to find new ways to come together, to check in on each other, to offer help, to rebuild trust in small, steady ways. Reporters from around the country covered the trial, but many took care to tell the story gently, focusing not on sensational details, but on the dignity of the families and the hope for healing. For every question about how such darkness could have existed undetected, there were stories about how people had come together in the face of tragedy, how volunteers had searched, how neighbors had supported each other, how strangers had reached out with letters and prayers. The worst of times brought out the best in many, and these stories, too, became part of the public memory. Inside the court, Gacy himself was a complicated figure. He appeared composed, sometimes even defiant, answering questions, consulting with his lawyers, and often maintaining the same confidence that had carried him through his public life. He showed little emotion when confronted with evidence, or with the voices of the families he had hurt. For some, this was an additional cruelty. For others, it was simply a final confirmation of the disconnect that defines so much of his story. The jury, faced with days of testimony and the weight of 33 lost lives, deliberated with great care. The evidence was overwhelming, the stories heartbreaking, and the need for justice pressing. In March of 1980, they returned their verdict. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was clear: death, a rare but unanimous decision in a state that had seen few such cases. For the families, the verdict was not an end, but a step, a small measure of accountability in a world still shaken by absence and grief. Some found comfort in the justice served, others struggled with the knowledge that no verdict could bring back what was lost. The trial had offered a place to speak, to be heard, and to see the faces of those who had worked so hard to honor their loved ones. In that space, many found new strength, new connections, and a path forward, however uncertain. The city of Chicago, too, was changed. In the aftermath of the trial, efforts to improve safety and support for missing children intensified. Programs were launched to educate parents, to train police, and to create systems for tracking and investigating disappearances. Community groups held meetings, built new networks, and made space for voices that had too often been ignored. The memory of the boys and young men lost to Gacy became part of the fabric of the city, remembered in scholarships, in gardens, in the hearts of those who had learned the importance of vigilance and compassion. The trial was over, but the story was not. Gacy would spend years appealing his conviction, his name occasionally returning to the news. For the families, the neighbors, and the police who had lived through it, the work of healing continued, quietly, day by day, in the rhythms of ordinary life restored, in the laughter that slowly returned to kitchens and parks and schoolyards. In the shadow of what had been lost, the people of Chicago found new ways to hold each other up. They honored the past by looking after the present, by checking in, by reaching out, by remembering. Justice, imperfect and hard-won, was a beginning, not an end. In the months and years that followed, the city would continue to learn from the pain, to tell the stories of the lost, and to choose, again and again, the slow work of hope. When the jury's verdict was read in that crowded Chicago courtroom, guilty on all counts, many hoped that the worst chapter in the city's history might finally be closed. But the reality, as the families of Gacy's victims soon learned, was that healing would be a much longer road, shaped by quiet resilience, small acts of remembrance, and the slow, often invisible, work of reclaiming ordinary life. After his conviction in 1980, John Wayne Gacy was transferred to Illinois' Menard Correctional Center to await execution. It was a move that seemed to signal the end, at least for the city, but for the families and investigators, the shadow of the case lingered. The legal process was far from over. Gacy's team filed appeal after appeal, arguing over technicalities and raising new questions about the original investigation, the trial, and even Gacy's mental state. The appeals dragged on for years, and each time the story resurfaced in the news, the pain was revived for those who had spent years searching, hoping, and grieving. For many families, these years were marked by both sorrow and quiet strength. Some parents and siblings attended every hearing, determined not to let their loved one's memory be lost in the slow machinery of the courts. Others turned inward, finding comfort in their own ways, through faith, through family, through the rituals of everyday life. Every holiday, every birthday, every missed graduation or wedding was another reminder of absence. Yet, over time, many also discovered new sources of resilience, the bonds formed with other families, the gentle kindness of neighbors, the way the city itself seemed to remember and care. Chicago, too, was changing. The aftermath of the case left a permanent mark on how the city, and the nation, approached the safety of children and young people. Community organizations sprang up, led by families and advocates who refused to let tragedy be the final word. They spoke in schools and churches, helped draft new laws, and pushed for better resources for families of the missing. Their work was often quiet, even invisible, but it changed the landscape, creating new systems for sharing information, training police officers, and supporting those caught in the aftermath of loss. One of the most important legacies of these years was the rise of victim advocacy. The families and survivors of Gacy's crimes, once alone in their grief, became leaders in a movement that demanded recognition, dignity, and support. They fought for the right to speak at parole hearings, to be notified of developments in cases, and to ensure that the memory of their loved ones was honored in every way possible. Victims' rights groups took root and grew, transforming the legal system and the broader culture to center those most deeply affected by violence. For the detectives and officers who had worked the Gacy case, the aftermath was also a time of reflection and resolve. Some retired, their careers marked forever by the darkness they had uncovered and the families they had served. Others remained, becoming mentors to younger officers, teaching the lessons learned at such great cost, the importance of listening, of taking every disappearance seriously, of never underestimating the pain left in the wake of violence. Many carried the stories of the lost with them, honoring their memory in every case that followed. In the wider world, the story of Gacy was retold again and again, in news reports, documentaries, books, and classrooms. But gradually, the focus shifted. It became less about the man at the center of the crime, and more about those who had been affected, the boys and young men whose lives had been cut short, the families who endured the unimaginable, the city that learned to look out for one another in new ways. The victims' names were read aloud at vigils and memorials. Their faces looked out from yearbooks and photo albums. The question became not, how could this happen? But, how do we remember, and what do we do next? Healing, for most, was never a single moment, but a process measured in seasons and small victories. A mother lighting a candle on her son's birthday. A brother organizing a community run in memory of a friend. A neighbor checking in on another's family, or a teacher reminding her students to look out for one another. The acts of remembrance and resilience were woven quietly into the life of the city. As the years passed and the legal appeals dwindled, the focus slowly shifted away from Gacy himself. Attention turned to the work still to be done, improving the systems that protect children, supporting families in times of crisis, making sure every life is seen and valued. The faces and names of those lost to Gacy became symbols of what the city was determined to never allow again, a shared commitment that outlasted even the longest, darkest nights. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the victim advocacy movement had spread far beyond Chicago. National organizations began to lobby for better laws, more sensitive media coverage, and resources for families. Hotlines and missing children's networks were launched, and the Amber Alert system would later be inspired by tragedies like those that had rocked Chicago. These changes, slow and hard-won, stood as living memorials, small acts of hope and protection born from the hardest lessons. Throughout it all, the work of memory continued. Families and friends held onto photographs, shared stories, and planted trees in local parks. Schools hosted assemblies and moments of silence. Memorial scholarships were founded, supporting young people whose lives might help carry forward the dreams left unfinished. These acts, however humble, became the city's way of saying, "We remember. We care. Your life mattered." In those years, as the distance from the trial grew, many families found their own paths to peace. For some, it was in advocacy and public remembrance. For others, in the privacy of a home filled with laughter and new beginnings. Some never spoke publicly again, choosing quiet healing over headlines. All, in their own way, contributed to the slow work of making the world a little safer, a little kinder, in memory of those lost. As Gacy's time on death row finally neared its end, there was a sense in the city that justice, while never able to erase the pain, had at least held firm. Yet, even then, the focus remained on the lives that had been taken, on the families that endured, and on the ongoing work of care and vigilance. The legacy of those years was not the infamy of a single man, but the strength of a community that refused to forget, that chose, again and again, to remember, to support, and to hope. By the early 1990s, the world around John Wayne Gacy had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The city of Chicago, once haunted by the unspeakable discoveries beneath a single house on Somerdale Avenue, had become a place determined not to be defined by darkness. New laws protected the missing, advocacy groups flourished, and a generation grew up with their parents' gentle insistence to look out for each other, to trust their instincts, and to hold tight to what was good and safe. But for the families of the boys and young men who had disappeared, for the investigators who had searched, and for the neighbors who had once called Gacy a friend, there remained a sense of unfinished business. Each year brought reminders, anniversaries, headlines, the slow movement of legal appeals. Gacy, locked away in Menard Correctional Center, became less a figure of fear than of endurance, a name that lingered at the edges of news reports, a photograph that resurfaced when the wheels of justice turned once again. His appeals wound through the courts for more than a decade, each one met with a familiar mixture of anxiety and exhaustion by those who had already waited so long. Some families followed every hearing, every headline. Others found their peace by turning away, focusing instead on remembrance and the healing of ordinary life. The community watched, sometimes with hope, sometimes with dread, as the final chapters played out far from the spotlight that had once burned so brightly. Gacy himself gave interviews in those last years, speaking with journalists, writers, and even artists. He insisted on his innocence in some conversations, toyed with confessions in others, and painted macabre images that sold at auction for causes both good and questionable. To some, his voice was just noise, an echo of a life that had already taken too much. For others, every word was a reminder of the unresolved questions, the mysteries that would never fully be explained. But for most, there was a growing certainty that, at last, an ending was near. On the evening of May 9, 1994, Illinois prepared for Gacy's execution by lethal injection. Outside the prison in downstate Chester, crowds gathered, some in solemn vigil, some in protest, others simply to witness a moment that felt heavy with history. The faces in the crowd were lit by candles and the glow of television cameras, but the air was quiet, expectant, marked by the weight of years spent waiting for justice to take its final step. Inside, the families of Gacy's victims had been given a choice: to witness the execution or to remain apart. Some came, seeking closure or a sense of finality, though few found true relief in those moments. Others chose to be together in quieter places, gathered in homes or at memorial sites, holding photographs, sharing memories, lighting candles for the ones they still missed so dearly. For many, the execution was not a triumph, but an ending, a necessary chapter, but not the one that would ever bring back what had been lost. The moment itself passed quickly. Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994. In the hours and days that followed, the world tried to process what it meant. Some spoke of justice finally served, others reflected on the costs, of the years spent waiting, of the pain relived with every new appeal, of the simple fact that no verdict, no sentence, no execution could ever truly balance the scales. For the families, reactions were as varied as the lives they had lived. A few expressed relief that Gacy was gone, hoping that the shadow he had cast would at last begin to fade. Others described a hollowness, a recognition that the long fight was over, but the ache of absence would remain. For some, the end brought new questions, about forgiveness, about how to move on, about what it meant to carry a memory that would always be unfinished. In Chicago, the news of Gacy's execution was met mostly with quiet reflection. There were no mass celebrations, no loud proclamations. Instead, there was a sense of respect for the families who had endured so much, and a collective acknowledgement of all the work that had been done to keep their loved ones' memories alive. Churches and community centers held small gatherings and moments of silence. In neighborhoods once touched by fear, people paused to remember and to hope that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. The years that followed brought a kind of gentle reckoning. The focus shifted more fully to those who had been lost, their lives, their dreams, the families who carried their stories forward. Schools, parks, and organizations founded in their memory thrived. Scholarships were awarded, gardens grew, and murals were painted, not just as reminders of sorrow, but as living tributes to the beauty and possibility that each boy and young man had brought into the world. Victim advocacy, once a small and fragile movement, became a powerful force. Families who had once grieved in silence now spoke at conferences, helped write new laws, and offered comfort to those facing their own tragedies. Their work was rooted not in revenge, but in compassion, a belief that the pain they had known could help others avoid the same fate. The city became more attentive, more willing to listen, more committed to the safety of every child and the dignity of every life. The story of John Wayne Gacy, though, would always contain unanswered questions, identities never fully recovered, moments never understood, wounds that would never truly heal. But as the years passed, the focus turned ever more to the ways in which a community can mend, through kindness, through remembrance, through a shared determination to make the world a little safer, a little gentler, a little more loving than it was before. In the quiet after the headlines faded, those who had lived through the hardest days often found comfort in the smallest rituals. A walk in a favorite park, a note from a friend, the laughter of children who had never known the name that once cast such a long shadow. They taught each other, and the city, that healing is not forgetting, but carrying forward what is good and true. So it was that the end of Gacy's life, while a necessary closing of a long and difficult chapter, was not the end of the story for those who loved and remembered. Their work, their care, and their hope continued to ripple outward, shaping the world in ways small and large. In this, the true legacy of the story became clear, not the cruelty of a single man, but the love, courage, and resilience of those who survived, who spoke, and who remembered. In the years that followed John Wayne Gacy's execution, Chicago found itself in a long, quiet process of recovery, a journey that was as much about memory as it was about moving forward. The trial and its aftermath had left deep marks, not only on the families and friends of those lost, but also on the neighborhoods that had once been defined by their trust in one another. It would take time, years even, for the community to find its footing again, and in that space, new forms of hope and resilience began to take root. For the families of Gacy's victims, there was no single moment when grief ended or when the past could be fully set aside. Instead, there was the slow work of living with absence, learning to carry it with a little more ease as the seasons changed and new chapters began. Birthdays and holidays remained bittersweet. There were empty chairs at the table, unopened presents, dreams that would forever belong to another time. Yet, in the privacy of home and the warmth of friendships, families found small ways to honor and remember. A candle lit in the window, a letter written to a lost son or brother, a walk along a favorite street or through a park that held memories of laughter and light. Some families chose to become advocates, channeling their pain into action. They spoke out about the need for better laws, for more sensitive reporting on missing persons, for changes in how police handled the first, crucial hours when someone vanished. Their voices, once nearly drowned out by disbelief or bureaucracy, became part of a growing movement, one that insisted that every disappearance mattered, that every family deserved answers, that no one should suffer in silence or be left alone with their fears. Advocacy, in those years, became a way to build meaning from tragedy. Some parents helped found local and national organizations, creating networks of support for others facing the unthinkable. They hosted vigils and marches, spoke at schools and city council meetings, and offered comfort to strangers who had become part of a shared story. For these families, the work was not just about justice, but about love, a way to keep alive the memory of the sons and brothers they had lost, to ensure that their lives would shape a better, safer world. The city of Chicago, too, found ways to remember. Parks and playgrounds were dedicated in the names of the lost. Murals and public art invited neighbors to pause and reflect, to see not just the pain, but the beauty and promise that had been stolen away. Community centers offered counseling and support, hosting groups where grief could be spoken and understood. Schools taught lessons in both safety and empathy, reminding students to care for one another, to notice who was missing, to reach out to those who might be struggling. The lessons of the past, once learned at such a cost, became a quiet thread running through the fabric of everyday life. Law enforcement, humbled and changed by the failures of the past, continued to adapt. The response to missing persons shifted from skepticism to urgency. New databases made it easier to connect cases across jurisdictions. Officers were trained to listen more carefully, to believe families, to treat every report as the beginning of a story that mattered. Some detectives who had worked the Gacy case retired, but others stayed on, carrying forward the lessons and the memories, determined to never let another tragedy go unnoticed. For those who had lived through the story, healing came in many forms. Some found comfort in faith, in the rituals and prayers that gave shape to sorrow. Others turned to art or music, creating beauty where before there had been only pain. Many leaned on the support of friends and neighbors, building new traditions that honored the past while allowing space for new beginnings. Weddings were celebrated, children were born, laughter slowly returned to kitchens and living rooms. Life, in all its ordinariness, became the greatest act of defiance against the darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming. There were, of course, moments when old wounds reopened, an anniversary, a news report, the discovery of another unidentified victim, or the publication of another book or film. But with each of these moments, families and communities found themselves less alone. They had become part of a network of remembrance and support that stretched far beyond Chicago, reaching families across the country and around the world. In their courage, others found strength. In their stories, others found the hope that healing, while never complete, was always possible. The memory of Gacy's crimes did not fade, but it changed shape. It became less about the man himself and more about the people he had tried, but failed, to erase. The faces and names of the victims, their dreams and their laughter, were honored again and again, not as symbols of loss, but as reminders of love, possibility, and the simple, stubborn hope that outlives even the longest night. With time, some of the families became advocates for restorative justice and reform, seeking not only accountability but also a more compassionate response to violence. They spoke of the importance of community, of listening, of looking out for one another, of building a world where every child felt seen and valued. Their work, quiet, sometimes invisible, helped reshape the culture of grief, transforming it from isolation into a source of connection and change. Chicago, once known for a tragedy it could hardly speak of, became a city determined to remember and to do better. Annual gatherings were held to honor the lost, scholarships were awarded in their names, and local organizations continued the slow, steady work of prevention and support. In neighborhoods once shadowed by fear, new generations grew up with a sense of both caution and compassion, learning that vigilance and kindness could live side by side. Through all of this, the central truth remained: every life mattered. The boys and young men lost to Gacy were not defined by what had happened to them, but by the love they had given and the dreams they had carried. Their families, their friends, and their communities held fast to that memory, refusing to let darkness have the final word. In this way, the aftermath of tragedy became the beginning of something else, a renewed commitment to one another, a belief in the power of remembrance, and the slow, ongoing work of hope. The legacy of those years was not only the pain of what was lost, but the gentle, persistent light of what remained, a community, a city, and a network of families who had learned, in the hardest way, how to hold each other up and carry each other forward. With the passing of years, the story of John Wayne Gacy became something different than it once was. What began as a tale of loss and heartbreak gradually transformed into a narrative of remembrance, healing, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. For families, neighbors, and the city of Chicago itself, the process of moving forward was neither quick nor simple. It unfolded slowly, like the changing of the seasons, marked by countless small acts of courage, kindness, and hope. The names and faces of those lost remained at the heart of it all. They were remembered not as victims of one man's cruelty, but as sons, brothers, classmates, and friends, young people whose laughter once filled kitchens and whose dreams once soared toward futures that, heartbreakingly, never arrived. Their families became stewards of memory, finding new ways to keep alive the light of lives interrupted. Through photos, stories, anniversaries, and the simple act of saying a name, they held fast to what was good and true, refusing to let the world forget. For Chicago, the aftermath of the Gacy case was a time of reckoning and renewal. The city learned hard lessons about trust, about the importance of listening to those who feel unseen, about the need for vigilance and compassion in equal measure. Community groups formed and flourished, drawing strength from the pain they had endured. Annual memorials, scholarships, and public spaces dedicated in memory of the lost served as quiet reminders that every life has value, and that hope can grow from even the deepest sorrow. The work of healing was ongoing, shaped by new challenges and the wisdom gained from old ones. Law enforcement agencies adopted new protocols for missing persons, training officers to respond with urgency and empathy. Schools and community organizations offered programs in safety and self-advocacy, helping young people find their voices and support each other. The lessons learned from Gacy's crimes became part of a living legacy, carried forward in every effort to protect the vulnerable and to build a safer, more caring world. Advocacy, too, evolved. The families and survivors who had once spoken only in grief became advocates for change, traveling to speak at conferences, helping to write legislation, and guiding others through their own experiences of loss. Their courage in telling their stories helped to shift the culture, creating space for open conversations about trauma, resilience, and the needs of victims and their families. Across the country, the ripple effects could be felt: new laws, new resources, and new networks of support growing in the shadows of tragedy. Yet, for all the work that was done, there remained moments when the past returned: a familiar face in the news, a newly identified victim, or the anniversary of a disappearance. These reminders were not always easy, but over time, they became less about reopening wounds and more about honoring what had been endured. In these moments, communities gathered not just to mourn, but to celebrate lives lived and to support those still struggling. The strength found in remembrance became a beacon, a light that could guide others through their own darkest nights. The story of John Wayne Gacy was never just about a single man or a series of crimes. It was, and always will be, about the enduring connections between people, the ways in which families hold each other close, neighbors reach out in kindness, and communities find ways to heal together. The boys and young men whose lives were taken were never forgotten. Their memories inspired 1,000 small acts of love, each one a quiet victory over the silence that once seemed overwhelming. For those who survived, healing became an act of defiance, a choice to move forward, to build new families, to find joy in the everyday. Some became leaders in their communities, others chose lives of quiet service. Many spoke openly about their journeys, offering comfort and wisdom to others facing similar losses. Their stories, shared and heard, became a testament to the resilience that outlives even the greatest sorrow. In the world at large, the legacy of the Gacy case served as a constant reminder: evil can hide in plain sight, but so can goodness, courage, and the determination to protect and remember. New generations learn the importance of caring for one another, of noticing who is missing, of believing the quiet voices that too often go unheard. Parents taught their children not just to be careful, but to be kind. Teachers reminded their students that every person's story matters, and that the greatest strength often comes from compassion and connection. As the story receded into history, it did not disappear. It became part of the city's fabric, woven into the daily acts of care and vigilance that defined life after tragedy. Gardens bloomed where there had once been only sorrow. Laughter returned to playgrounds and parks. Neighborhoods, once marked by fear and suspicion, became places of renewal and hope. The work of remembrance continued, not as a burden, but as a promise, a commitment to carry forward the lessons learned, and to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. Through all these years, perhaps the most powerful legacy has been the quiet, steady presence of hope. For every life lost, there was a story of love, a mother's gentle remembrance, a brother's laughter, a friend's unbreakable bond. For every shadow cast, there was the persistent light of community, people coming together, time and again, to rebuild what was broken and to dream of a safer, more compassionate world. The names of those taken by Gacy are spoken with reverence, their lives celebrated for the joy they brought and the courage they inspired. Their absence is still felt, but their memory is alive, in every act of kindness, every gesture of support, every moment when a community chooses hope over fear. The city remembers, the families remember, and all those who have heard their story are changed by it, carrying forward the quiet truth that love, in the end, endures. So as the seasons continue their turning and the years stretch onward, the story of Gacy's victims remains not one of defeat, but of resilience. It is a story of families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, of a city that found new ways to care, and of a world that, despite everything, chooses again and again to remember, to honor, and to hope.